Hello, everyone. Happy Earth Week. I want to thank Dr. Barbara Wall, Vice President for Mission and Ministry, for inviting me to talk about Native American environmentalism during Villanova's Earth Week. And I want to thank her for her constant support over several decades of Native American programs, both on campus and off. This talk was originally scheduled for Driscoll Hall, but certain events have made that impossible. But I'm grateful to have this opportunity to offer a short historical overview of Native American environmental activism and consider how it has dovetailed with contemporary sustainability and environmental justice campaigns. I'd like to start with a few images of the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance movement that began in September 2016, when thousands of people descended on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota in an effort to stop a Texas company from building an oil pipeline, which Native and non-Native activists contended would contaminate local water supplies and disturb Indian burial grounds and other sites the Sioux considered sacred. It was one of the few times in recent history that Native people have garnered both national and international attention. The resistance gave Native leaders a forum for championing their ecological values while highlighting ongoing threats to their tribal sovereignty, becoming a symbol of environmental resistance around the world in the process. During the months-long encampment, the organizers attracted a range of supporters from President Obama to Bernie Sanders to the actor Mark Ruffalo, pictured in the middle photo. Ruffalo contributed solar panels to help power the encampment over several months. The encampment also reinforced the stereotype of the traditionalist Indian opposed to progress and industrial development. The US Chamber of Commerce, for example, called the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and supporters from nearly 300 other Native communities, quote, anti-energy protesters, denouncing them as a disruptive and radical force. But the activists considered themselves protectors rather than protesters, fighting for a sensible energy policy rather than just against one that jeopardized sacred waters and land. To understand the Dakota Access Pipeline story, it's important to recognize that Native Americans have been contributing to a national and international movement for environmental health and justice since the 1960s. They have been fighting for a cleaner environment for all Americans and for all people, rather than just blindly protesting progress. As a Navajo politician put it, Indians and non-Indians are bound up in the same future, unquote. Native people have been waging these campaigns for a variety of reasons. One, many Native Americans consider themselves patriotic Americans, having served in armed forces over the 20th century. They believe their ecological philosophies and practices can contribute to the healing of Mother Earth. Along with other people of color, they have suffered the brunt of industrial development. And they know that pollution doesn't recognize the boundary lines that demarcate Native reservations. I'd like to illustrate these themes via a short series of images. First, it's important to understand what the Indian reservation as a geographic place and a cultural space means to Native people. It's a familiar story, but in brief, smallpox epidemics killed tens of thousands of Native people between the 1830s and 1860s, weakening their resistance to US settler expansion. In the mid-1800s and beyond, the US government forced Native people to adapt to smaller homelands and new lifestyles, in part by eliminating the buffalo as a food source through mass slaughter campaigns. The industrial scale of the slaughter is seen in this mountain of buffalo skulls, which became useful for agriculture, agricultural fertilizer, and bone china. By the 1870s, Native people were relegated to reservations created by treaties with the US government. But those reservations shrank in the late 19th century and early 20th century from imposed land sales, such as the federal allotment policy, which granted the best agricultural land to non-native farmers. Since that time, Native people have fought to preserve what was left of their lands and their resources. Today, there are 574 Native nations scattered throughout the United States, concentrated in the Southwest, California, Great Plains, Alaska, Pacific Northwest, Oklahoma, and the Upper Midwest. All of them have experienced, to some degree, this shrinking of homelands, as well as the loss of valuable natural resources such as water, oil, rangeland, and minerals. During the 1950s and 1960s, Native people lost more land to development projects such as dams. The two images here show the two most controversial dams, the Garrison Dam on the Missouri River and the Kinzua Dam in Western Pennsylvania, which flooded thousands of acres of the Seneca Nation in New York, including sacred burial grounds. The Kinzua Dam construction in particular fueled a new era in Native resistance, as activists saw it as a symbol of the federal government's refusal to honor treaties that were supposed to protect their reservations. Another source of concern was state government's crackdown on traditional fishing practices in the Pacific Northwest and in Wisconsin, practices that treaties were supposed to protect. In Washington state, state troopers attacked Native fishing camps and arrested Native men, women, and children. In Wisconsin, non-Native citizens staged racist protests such as the one pictured here over Chippewa attempts to spearfish in their traditional manner. A variation on this sign is "Save a walleye, spear a pregnant squaw." Fortunately, in both cases, federal courts sided with Native people, citing the legal validity of treaties signed in the 1850s. Native Americans' environmental crisis emerged most forcefully in the American Southwest due to an expansion of strip mining in the Black Mesa region of the Navajo and Hopi nations and the creation of the Four Corners Power Plant, the largest coal burning plant in the United States. The coal and the power plant were used to create electricity for growing populations in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and other Western cities, even as most Navajo and Hopi homes lacked electricity. Navajo and Hopi protests were joined by mainstream environmental groups such as the Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth. Press coverage in major newspapers, including the London Times and on TV networks, brought the issue to millions of Americans who came to understand Native American struggles as their struggles, in part because pollution from Black Mesa threatened the nearby Grand Canyon, which had become increasingly popular in the 1960s. The Black Mesa crisis emerged at the same time as the iconic crying Indian image became featured in an April 1971 ad by Keep America Beautiful, which promoted it on billboards and in a TV segment, showing an Indian figure surrounded by smokestacks and litter, a single tear rolling down his cheek. The ad was problematic for various reasons. It froze Native people in time and space. The figure was wearing buckskin, riding a horse, or paddling a canoe. And it helped cement the notion that American Indians were different from other Americans. At the same time, it showed Native Americans caring about natural resources, using them wisely, and thus demonstrating how they modeled behavior that American society needed to ameliorate its own environmental crisis, which Earth Day in 1970 and 1971 had publicized. But America's environmental crisis was Native America's crisis. Indian reservations were targeted for natural resource extraction, such as Black Mesa coal, as well as uranium. They paid a much greater price for industrial development than non-natives in terms of health. Native Americans thus sought new alliances with groups like the Sierra Club in a national and then international movement to protect land, air, and water from pollution that didn't stop at the edge of the reservation. And they began to campaign for environmental justice to ameliorate this toxic legacy of industrialization that had contaminated homes, water, and lands on their reservation for decades. The Navajo, in particular, had suffered devastating health problems from federal uranium mining projects that started in the 1950s and continued into the 1980s, creating 524 open uranium mining sites. Several of these environmental justice groups reflects that toxic legacy. In the 1980s and 1990s, they formed coalitions with other people of color experiencing similar problems to pursue sustainable economic development and environmental justice. The most important of these coalitions was the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, which took place in Washington, D.C. in 1991. Several of the principles embody key tenets of Native ecological beliefs, including the sacredness of Mother Earth and the interconnectedness of the natural world, as well as the legacy of uranium mining. Native activists also pursued their goals in international conferences, beginning with the 1972 Stockholm Summit, the first United Nations Summit on the global environment. Several dozen Native activists from Hopi and Navajo lands attended as the Black Mesa crisis unfolded. Condemning the Cold War legacy of uranium mining on reservations in Arizona, Nevada, and Washington State, Native activists attended the 1992 World Uranium Hearings in Austria. By then, hundreds of Navajo uranium miners had died, and hundreds of other Navajo had developed cancers and other illnesses associated with radiation poisoning. Then they joined other indigenous groups at the 2002 Earth Summit in South Africa in an effort to broaden environmental justice to climate justice, helping to shape new climate justice principles modeled after the People of Color environmental justice principles of 1991. And more recently, Native activists joined several hundred indigenous leaders at the Convening of Indigenous Peoples for the Healing of Mother Earth in Mexico, one of a series of pan-indigenous meetings to address climate change in particular. Native people also work to address pollution and climate change by expanding alternative energy grids on reservations. Activists and entrepreneurs held conferences such as these two in 1978 to explore ways to expand wind and solar power in particular. And then in the 1990s began to address climate change more directly. There are numerous examples of this effort of entrepreneurs and activists to expand alternative energy development. Let me give you just two examples. The first is Native Renewables, which began on the Navajo reservation, but has expanded to indigenous communities in Canada and in Alaska. And the second is the Kayenta Solar Farm, which went online in 2017 in phase 1. It created hundreds of jobs for Navajo workers, in addition to expanding a clean energy grid for use on the reservation, where 15,000 homes still lack electricity. Sustainability education that integrates indigenous and scientific approaches has become especially important to Native people via programs such as the WISAPEN Leadership and Sustainability Program in South Dakota, another program in New York State. Another program is run through the Menominee Nation's Sustainable Development Institute in Wisconsin, which employs knowledge from running the nation's oldest sustainable forestry operation. Another recent initiative is the Just Transition Agenda that seeks to integrate sustainability into every aspect of tribal governance and practice and address that toxic legacy still affecting many Native people. Finally, let me close by moving beyond these local initiatives to provide a snapshot of national and international Native environmental priorities via resolutions from the National Congress of American Indians, the largest pan-tribal political organization in the country. The statement from NCAI President Brian Cladusby speaks to Native beliefs about creating a sustainable world for 7 generations in the future and sharing their ecological knowledge with the global community. After President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017, the NCAI issued the following statement. Whereas climate change is one of the greatest threats facing the peoples of the world today, and indigenous peoples are often the most severely impacted by the effects of climate change. Whereas indigenous peoples depend upon the health of their ecosystems and natural resources for social, economic, and cultural vitality, and climate change threatens to destroy indigenous ways of life that have been sustained for thousands of years, end quote. The NCAI resolved to continue to support the Paris Climate Agreement, encourage other governments to continue to support it, and to put into practice the measures needed to mediate climate change, such as investment in renewable energy and sustainability education. And as the Dakota pipeline resistance movement demonstrated, Native people are willing to confront industrial development projects that don't accord with this agenda, joining millions of other denizens of this interrelated and interdependent ecosystem called Earth, who believe they have a sacred responsibility to protect and care for the land and all of life, as well as to safeguard its well-being for future generations to come. Thank you. Happy Earth Week, and be well.